Thank you for joining. This is Gator Bio's organized Rich and Chips Tips and Tricks webinar on how to get the most out of your BLI system. My name is Subodh Nimkar, and I'm the marketing director at Gator Bio, based in Palo Alto, California. With me here is Rich Wong. He's our senior application scientist, one of the presenters of the webinar today. And also on the call is Dr. Chip Slabaugh. He is a co-presenter today. So both Rich and Chip will be presenting this webinar. Before we dive into the actual topic, let me just do some housekeeping items. All the attendees are muted. Please ask your questions through the question and answer box, and Rich and Chip will answer the question at the end of their prepared talk. And also, if there are any specific questions about software, then we may be able to do we may be able to show the software at the end, should the time permit. This entire webinar is being recorded and will be available to all the people who registered and attended, and we will be sending a link to this within a day or two. And if there are questions that go unanswered because of time, then we will answer those questions by email. With that said, before Rich and Chip get into their talk, I just want to do a quick introduction to Gator Bio for those who are not familiar with the company. Gator Bio was founded by Hong Tan, who was also a co-founder of Forte Bio, and this was in 2001. In 2002, the first BLI prototype was developed by the team, and then Forte Bio introduced the octet in 2006. Hong Tan and Bob Zook, the founders of Gator Bio, always believed that there was still a lot of scope for improvement in the technology, and decided to invest in next-gen BLI. And that's where we are right now. And after 2018, we announced two systems, Gator Prime and Gator Plus. Further on, Gator Bio is an extremely solid financial and IP founding. We have more than $100 million in funding, 50 patents granted. Pylon is our diagnostic instrument that was developed here in Palo Alto, but first commercialized in China through Chinese FDA, and we have more than 2,000 systems installed through our sister company, ET Healthcare. In the US, the install base of Gator Bio is in high double digits, and we are growing quite rapidly. And thanks to all of our users for their support and belief in our technology. Our research is happening in Palo Alto, California. And as you have met, we have a team of experienced field scientists and engineers that support all our users. Today, we offer a wide range of biosensors and consumables, two systems, Gator Prime and Gator Plus, and then application-specific software that supports quantitation, kinetics, and epitope binning. Here, I just want to give you a quick overview of all the biosensors we have, and the latest one that we launched, which is for quantitation of AAV serotyping using the Gator AAVX probe and the Flex assay probe, which is a streptavidin, or the first streptavidin probe that can be reactivated and can be used multiple times. Gator Bio also offers on-demand probes and custom probes if there are any specific requirements. With that, I would like to hand it over to Rich to get into the main topic and do his talk. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Sabo. And here is today's hour's agenda. First, I will go through what is biolayer interferometry, what is BLI. Then I will go through how to set up any BLI experiment and go through our two main applications, quantitation and kinetics, the tips and tricks, and how to analyze your result, and the tips and tricks for troubleshooting on BLI experiment. First of all, what is the biolayer interferometry? So if you have a partial white light beams hit the upper and the lower boundaries, either enhancing or reducing the wavelength. For example, on this screen, on the upper left figure, you can see the antibody if the light hit each face of the boundary and reflect it back. However, if we look at the bottom left, the figure, if the optical thickness got changed because of some molecule binding to the surface, then we can see this interference pattern got changed. And for example, what is the interference pattern? If you have two waves in phase, then they can combine as a constructive interference. However, if these two waves are 180 out of phase, when they combine together, they can become a destructive interference. So the BLI founder, Dr. Hong Tan, he applied this biophysics principle to this glass-made probe. So the white light going through this glass probe and hit each face of the boundary, the coating, optical coating phase, or the surface chemistry, and reflect it back. So over the time, monitoring this optical thickness change allows us to observe the binding behavior of the target molecules. Here is the short video to present the BLI, this technology. So you can see if you have a light source from the top of these glass-made probes going through this probe, and then hit each face of the boundary, then reflect it back. So these, when they combine together, you can see these interference pattern wavelengths. However, if some molecules bind to the surface, it changes this optical thickness, and then we can observe this nanometer shift. The whole wavelength got shifted, and our software can interpret this wavelength interference pattern into the real binding signal, the nanometer shift. If there's no optical thickness change, this will be a flat line. And of course, if there's another molecule binds to the surface, we can see another nanometer shift again. Then we can observe this binding up chain, this binding signal, as you can see here. Yeah. And vice versa. If this molecule falls off from the surface, if this molecule falling off from the surface, from our surface, then you can see the downtrend signal. This interference pattern got shift back to the left, and then we can observe this dissociation, this binding behavior of this target molecule happen to our surface. And then the next one is the guidance for all the BLI assays. First of all, we recommend if you turn off the machine, you should always turn it on and leave at least 30 minutes prior to your assay. The reason is you need to warm up this instrument at a working temperature. Second, because we have the chemistry cover to protect the surface chemistry for our probes. So before you use the probes, you should always hydrate the probes at least for 5 minutes to break down this protection, this surface chemistry on our sensor. Then what kind of buffer you should use is also very important. And we understand that most of the buffer you store at a 4 degree. However, if you're running your experiment, you should always pull out your AC buffer from the 4 degree and leave it at the room temperature before you start off your AC. And also here, this AC buffer, you should try to keep as consistent as possible to keep during over your whole ACs. And this is one of the example. If you have the buffer exchange during your AC, you can see this artifact jump between steps. Then the next one is you should choose the right buffer for your AC. How to choose it? So usually we would recommend the PBS buffer is always the good starting point you can start with. And then, of course, some addition of the surfactant and carrier protein can also minimize your non-specific binding throughout your assays. And our Gator TM, K, and Q buffer were formulated with some surfactants and carrier protein to reduce this non-specific binding happen through your assays. And of course, for some tight binding pairs, we have the PM buffer can be used to stabilize the baseline drift during this long dissociation state. So this is how you should choose the right buffer for your assay. And the next topic is you should choose the right probes for your design of your experiment. For example, sometimes it's very intuitive to pick up the right probes because it's very intuitive. Since if your protein with some tags, then for example, if you have the his tag or biotin on your protein, then it's very intuitive to choose the right probes like the anti-his probe or assay probe. However, sometimes it's always easy to switch the ligand and analyte, which means that you can reverse your interaction, the orientation for your assay. Then you can choose the different probes for a better result for your experiment. And sometimes for the most of our users for the antibody measurement, you can try our anti-human fat probe, can sometimes give you some insight to your project, to your interactions. So here we provide a different probes for different applications. And how to choose the right probes? We have some recommendation for the probes to a certain application. For example, we usually recommend our user to use our protein A, protein G, protein L for quantitation purpose only. The reason is if you want to use the protein A, G, L to do the kinetic, sometimes when it binds to the antibody, it will also bind a portion of the FC region and the Fab region, which will affect the real interaction between your antibody and your antigen. And here, as Sabo just aforementioned, we just launched the other new product called AAVX for quantitation purpose. So this AAVX, because as a Gator Bio, we are always exploring opportunities for different applications for our users for the ease of use of this BLI instrument. So this AAVX probe can quantitate your unknown sample in 2 minutes for up to 8 samples. And it can also be regenerated, be reused up to 10 times with the wide range serotype from 1 through 10. And this dynamic range can go down to 10E8 up to 10E9 up to 10E13. With the change of the protocol, sometimes you can go down to further this dynamic range, go down to 10E8, this wide range of the quantitation dynamic range. And what is the service on our AAVX probe? We use the cap select this binding to capture the capsid in your samples. Back to the quantitation. So I'm listing some items here. First of all, the probes. So you should always pick out the right probes for your quantitation experiment. And the most accurate and reliable result for the quantitation is you should keep everything as consistent as possible for your standards and your unknown samples. For example, these probes. And this probe, it means that if you're using our protein A probe to quantitate your unknown sample, then you should use the protein A probe to measure, to capture your standards as well. The second one, the buffer. And this buffer is very, very important to give you a reliable quantitation data. For example, if your buffer is in the condition media, if your unknown sample is in the condition media, then we highly recommend you should pick out the very close isotype and subtype antibody as your standards. And then you use this standard to spike in this condition media to cover the wide range of the concentration, to cover this linear range of your unknown sample. And also, we understand sometimes you have some non-specific binding or the background noise. So we provide this reference tool to subtract the background noise or the non-specific binding happen in the probes and the buffer. And we usually recommend if you want to quantitate the soup or in the condition media, which is very dirty, then we usually recommend you should hydrate the probes for a longer time, up to 20 minutes or even 30 minutes. But sometimes even you can hydrate the probes in the 4-degree overnight. But even though you will still see some background or blank noise, then this is why we recommend you should always have this reference to be subtracted when you're doing the data analysis to correct your data for the specific interaction. Then the next one is you should keep consistent as possible for your assay parameters, including the running temperature and the RPM of your least shaker speed. And also how you analyze your data. You should keep as consistent as possible so you can have the really reliable and repeatable result over your different assays. So the next one is a robust standard curve. We always recommend you should have at least 7 points and the +1 reference as the background. And how do we do this standard curve? For example, you can imagine we have the binding rate to correspond to each standard concentration. And this binding rate can represent some certain of concentration. And once you're doing the data analysis, then you can choose a different fitting model for your standard. And then once you have this fitting model for your standard curve, then you can apply this standard curve to your unknown samples. And based on those unknown samples, each unknown sample represents one binding rate. Then based on this standard curve, we can find the corresponding concentration for your unknown samples. So that being said, this dynamic range, this range of your standards should always cover the linear range of your unknown sample, which can give you the most reliable and the most robust result. The next one is the assay step. So we have the our default step is for 2 minutes at 400 RPM to cover the most wide range of your unknown samples. However, for a high concentration sample, for a high-end concentration unknown sample, then the step time can usually be reduced down to 30 seconds only, and you can also reduce the shaker speed down to 200 RPM. For the low concentration, low-end samples, then this step time can be increased, and you can also increase the shaker speed go up to 1000 RPM, and the time can be increased up to 300 seconds. And if you want to reuse our probes over and over again, you want to regenerate the probes, we always recommend that you should turn the regeneration before assay this option on. The reason is that if you don't turn it on, the very first of your interaction, this probe is totally fresh and it has never been regenerated before. Then it will be a little different from the following experiment. Then I'm turning to my colleague Chip to introduce the kinetic measurement.
Thank you, Rich. Hey, everyone. So I'm going to go through kinetics and talk about some tips and tricks throughout this section. Rich talked about probes, and just like in quantitation and kinetics, probes are very important. You'll be loading a ligand to your probe. So in this kinetics example, it's 5 steps. You see a baseline, a loading step, a wash step, and then the last 2 steps are your association and dissociation of the analyte. So I'll be talking about optimizing, mainly talking about the loading density, which is very important to very accurate kinetics. And the analyte concentration is also important. We'll talk about assay step times, and I'll go through some analysis and troubleshooting as well. So ligand loading. So this would be the first thing that you're going to be doing in your kinetics assay. Saturating the probe during this step is not always what you want. Saturating the probe will lead to crowding, and there's a lot of unwanted interactions that will occur due to this crowding: avidity, blocking, mass transport limited. So a good rule of thumb is to load to about 60%, or load 60% of the available binding sites in about 120 seconds. So you want to load slowly, and you want to capture the linear portion of your loading curve. So to optimize, you can load a few different ligand concentrations and see which concentration saturates the probe, and that will give you the R max, so the response max. And you can also see in 120 seconds which concentration reaches the 60% capture that you're looking for. So here's a depiction of what can happen when you crowd your probe surface with your ligand. So on the left, we see a nice homogeneous loading. So we have the ligand is loaded and the analyte can bind 1-to-1, and we observe 1 K on. So the graph on the left, we see a nice 1-to-1 K on and K off. On the right, we see a saturated probe. And what can happen here is avidity can come into play. So now we have 2 K ons. So in the association curve below, you see a fast component and a slow component. And this can really hinder accurate KDs. So you want to load to about that 60% of your capture and try to avoid this blocking, avidity, things like that. So now your concentration series. So when you're looking at KD, you need to have a concentration series of the analyte. And it's sometimes very not intuitive where this concentration series should be. Generally, an optimal concentration series will span your KD. So you want to go from about 1/10 your KD in moles to in molarity to about 10 times your KD. So on the right, we see what can happen when your concentration series is too high and when it is too low. And in the middle, this is what a good optimized concentration series should look like. So one of the first assays you can do to learn about your interactions is, I'm calling it this efficient first assay. So what I'm showing on the right is the plate setup for this assay. So by using just 4 probes, we can run through a few different loading concentrations, look at some analyte concentrations, and we can get a rough idea of what the KD is. And also that probe D, so in the fourth channel, that probe does not get loaded, and then it goes through the highest concentration of your analyte. In that curve, you will be able to see if there's any analyte binding to your probe. And if there is, that's something you would have to deal with. So this is from the software. This is the assay setup. So I had mentioned before, Kinetics is a 5-step assay. So what you're seeing here is the probe position in teal. So we're picking up probes from the first column of our probe plate. And then we go through these 5 steps. So the first step is in our first column, which is our buffer. And we run that for about 30 seconds. And then the second step goes into the loading. And we can do that for about 200 seconds. Then we'll go back to that first buffer column for a wash cycle. And then step 4 and 5 are the association and dissociation. So these times can kind of be tweaked, but from this template, you can learn a lot about your assay. So you'll get a rough KD, you'll get that loading concentration. So remember, we're looking for that 60% loading in about 120 seconds. So sometimes kinetics don't look great, and a lot of times it's due to biphasic interactions. And so the graph that you're looking at shows biphasic. So we see a fast component and a slow component. So a lot of things can lead to these biphasic traces. Some examples: non-specific binding, conformational changes, mass transport limited interactions, binding that's not one-to-one, and also ligand heterogeneity that can lead to biphasic interactions. So some of the things to deal with. So when you see this non-specific binding, you need to give it some attention. So there's a few things you can do. So yes, so some techniques. There's additives to buffer. So if you're using pure PBS, you can try adding some BSA or some other carrier protein. Changing the orientation can help sometimes. So if you're looking at antibody antigen interactions and you were using, let's say, the anti-human FC probe and looking at your antibody to antigen, you could try biotinylating your antigen and loading the antigen and having your analyte be the antibody. So you can change the orientation of your assay. There's also blocking steps you can do. So after the loading step, you can go through a step where you're the well will have a molecule that will bind to the remaining sites on your probe, so that when you go into your analyte, the non-specific binding that was happening will be blocked. And there's also some double references you can do. So picomolar interactions can be done on BLI, but there's, of course, limitations to the type of interactions that we can see on BLI. So for picomolar interactions, there's typically very, very long dissociation steps that are necessary. And even with these long dissociation steps, you might see just a very small decrease in your signal. And so we have the picomolar buffer. That's something that will stabilize this baseline and allow for much longer dissociation times. There's also rebinding. So this is one of the things that people talk about with BLI. In the dissociation step, you're in a well of buffer, and the analyte that unbinds has a small chance of rebinding. And that's something, of course, you don't want. So there's things you can do to limit that rebinding. Lowering the ligand density is one thing. And there's also a step you can do that involves an inhibitor molecule. So after you do your association, you can go, instead of just to a buffer well, you can have molecules in that well that will bind to unbound analytes. So analytes that unbind or dissociate will bind with the inhibitor, which will block it from rebinding. And like I said, the picomolar buffer that Gator has created is a very good tool for these tight binders. So for the kinetic analysis, this is the first page you would see in the software. And I'm not going to go into too many details about the analysis. We actually just released, Gator just released a technical note called Getting Started Kinetics Analysis. And it details everything about what to do in the software. There's a lot of troubleshooting tips and tricks in there as well. So I'm just going to briefly speak about what to do in these steps. For all kinetic analysis purposes, you will be aligning to the beginning of the association step. So here you would align the y-axis to the beginning of your association step. And once you do that, you would go to your set reference. Here's where you would subtract your reference signals. Now in the fitting, there's a few different models you can fit. And there's also fitting types. We have local and global fitting types. What local does is it gives kinetic constants for each curve independently. The global fit looks at all your concentrations and it includes all curves in the analysis, and you get one set of kinetic using the global fit. So a lot of questions we get from customers are, how do I know I have good data? I did all my fittings. I'm not sure if this fit is accurate. So a few of the things you can do are just, there's a visual check that I'll speak about. There's a residual graph, and there's some error that you can look at. R squared is a great goodness of fit parameter that is, once you do the analysis, you get the R squared values, and then you can check your local fit. So I'll speak about these. So the first thing you'll notice is how your fit looks. So if you look, both of these signals are from the same assay, and you can see how the fit on the left is so much better than the fit on the right. And that's because we properly aligned the curves to start at the beginning of the association step. On the right, these curves are not aligned, and therefore we see this deviation from the fit. So it's important that you properly align your kinetic curves. Now the residual graph is something to pay attention to. Basically, at the residual at any point in time is a measure of the difference in signal of your fit. So the value of your fit to the value of the real raw data. So what you're looking for is if at any given moment, your value of the residual is more than 10% of the real binding, the response of the actual binding, then this means it's not a good fit. So if you look down here, I've highlighted 3 different points where the residual is greater than 10% of the response. So we can see by eye, it's very clear to see that near the end of the association, we're deviating from that fit quite a bit. So you can also look at the K on and K off error. So this will help in determining what part of your assay is giving you trouble. Is it the association or the dissociation? And what makes a good fit is if the overall K on error or K off error is less than 10% of the fitted value, that's considered a good fit. So R squared, like I said, is a goodness of fit measure. Really what you're looking for is an R squared equal to 1. That means it's a great fit, generally. Sometimes I've seen R squared be very high and it's not a great fit. There's a few factors that go into that, but I'm not going to discuss in too many details, but a 0.95 to 0.98 R squared is considered a good fit, but you can typically get better than a 0.98. When I see a fit that's 0.98 or higher, I have confidence in the kinetic values that I get from the calculation. So when you're looking for kinetic constants, the most accurate thing you can do is create a concentration series and you do a global fit. But what you can do is once you do this global fit, you can go back and look at the local fit. So you can see what kinetic values are given to each concentration. And so on the right, we see this interaction has a global fit KD of 2.85 e to the minus 9. So if we do the local fit, we see that this lowest concentration is an anomaly. What I would suggest in a situation like this, taking out this anomaly should give you a more accurate KD. So I will hand it back over to you guys. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much, Rich and Chip, for a good overview. Now let's get into Q&A session. There are quite a few questions that have come in, and attendees, please keep sending your questions on the topics that were presented, or if you have questions on topics that were not discussed here related to BLI, you could pose those questions too. So let me start with the first question, and this relates to the shaking speed. Any downside of always using a high shaking speed such as 1000 RPM?
Yeah, so for example, it matters when you're doing the quantitation or kinetics. For the quantitation, I would say because our default setting is at 400 RPM, the reason why we don't recommend to use a very, very high shaking speed for quantitation purpose is because when you're doing the high, this very high shaking speed, then sometimes if your sample, they are all in the high end, which means that this on rate will be very, very fast. And if you're using this higher shaking speed, which means you can improve this on rate. So sometimes it's really hard to differentiate the high end sample. That's the reason why in the quantitation purpose, sometimes we don't recommend to always use a very, very high speed to do your interaction. On the other hand, if you're doing the kinetics, then I would suggest our default setting is 1000 RPM. So you can try always, you can, as Chip mentioned in this webinar, you can always try when you're doing this assay setup, this assay development, you can always try to start with this 1000 RPM for your kinetics purpose. However, if sometimes when you're doing this loading and you found that this at a certain concentration with this 1000 RPM is too high, then which means that you can try to lower this RPM and to give you a more even distributed loading capacity on your sensor, then which can give you the most reliable and the most beautiful kinetic data for your following association step.
Okay, Chip, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Rich just nailed it. I was going to just jump in for the next question, about the local fit.
Yeah, please go for it. So let me read the question.
Okay.
For everybody's benefit. When local fit of each curve gives quite different KD, what could be the reason and what can I do to avoid this?
Yeah, so this question is somewhat difficult to answer because a ton of things can lead to a deviation in a particular concentration. Of course, there's always pipetting error. So if you make an error in your assay setup, then the concentration you put into the software gets fitted. So K-on has a concentration dependency. So if there's an error in the concentration, that can lead to deviations from your global fit KD. There's also most of the time it's from a concentration that's either too high or too low for the type of interaction that you're looking at. If you're looking at an interaction that's, let's say, 5 nanomolar, and one of your concentrations is 1,000 nanomolar, you will be saturating you won't be saturating. You will see a huge deviation from good kinetic data, because remember, ideally you want to have your concentration series span 1/10 your KD to 10 times your KD. So if you're, let's say, 100 times your KD, that's a very good way to not see accurate kinetic constant values.
And thank you, Chip. And I would like to share some of my experience. Yeah. So when can I trust the KD from this local feed? So if, like Chip mentioned, when you're doing this local feed, and you can see a very, let's say, if you have these dose-dependent beautiful curves happen to your own interaction, and then some of the curves, it can show you this curvature. So it is very important for the fitting algorithm to have such curvature to give you the most the beautiful and the reliable fitting. The reason is all the algorithm, they are looking for the equilibrium setting, this state. Then it can give you the more beautiful curve to fit your data. So when you're looking at this dose-dependent curve, then you will see for most of those high-end or mid-end concentration, if you have those curvature, then those data, those fitting data, when you're using the local feed, it should give you a very, very close KD when you're doing the global feed. However, if you look at those very low-end concentration, they are just like a linear curve. So which can give you, although maybe it can still give you a good fit, like R squared can go up to 95, 96. However, the KD will be far away from when you're doing the global fit. That's when you cannot trust the KD data from the global fitting.
Yep. Thank you, Rich. Next question, actually, there are quite a few questions about small molecules and small proteins. So let me start with the first one. What are the things to consider for protein small molecule binding assays? So,
yeah.
Rich or Chip, who wants to take that?
Yeah, I can take this question. So what are things to consider for protein small molecular binding assay? The first one is, of course, I would say the size of the protein. And also, because based on our current technology, if you want to do this protein and small molecular binding assay, we always recommend our user to bioattenuate your protein to capture this bigger molecule on our SMAP probe. And then you can see this small molecular weight, small molecular interaction, if you can see that. And the other things that you should consider is that the buffer. For example, usually the small molecular, it can be dissolved in the DMSO. You have to dissolve them in the DMSO, this organic solvent. However, on our system, of course, you cannot use 100% DMSO to do your interaction. This will ruin our surface chemistry. So what I'm saying is, what you should do is you should pipette and make sure every single well, the concentration of your DMSO will be consistent through all your assay. Because over our webinar, one of the most important key points to give you a beautiful kind of data from BLI is to keep your assay buffer as consistent as possible throughout all the assay. So which means that if you're detecting this small protein and small molecular interaction, if you have any buffer difference, then you will see this jump. So this small signal from your small compound will be offset. So you cannot see the real and beautiful interaction. So I would say this is some main things that you should consider when you're doing this protein and small molecular interaction assays.
So a question related to that, I think this is a question about SMAP. So is SMAP for binding small peptides, or you use SMAP to bind, or to use, I'm just trying to read this question. The small molecule as a ligand, which one do you use SMAP for?
Yeah, so when we are using the SMAP, it always means that you should capture the bigger molecules on our surface and then serve your small compound, small analyte as the analyte, small ligands as the small molecule as the analyte in the solution for the association state, which means that you always capture a bigger like a bigger bed on our surface, then interact with this small compound.
Okay. Another question. Let me switch to some other topic and we'll come back to small molecules. What is the effect of evaporation on the raw data and analyzed data when you are measuring very long dissociation times?
Yeah. So what is the effect for the raw data and analyzed data? I would say if for the raw data, the evaporation will make your dissociation, this curve will be like wavy, more wavy over the time if you really hit this evaporation. The reason is you can imagine our probes, they are dipping into the buffer. However, if this, and we only measure the end of the surface, but if this buffer, because of the evaporation, so the buffer cannot reach the end of our surface, which means that our probes will be on the air. Then you will see a big, like a messy raw data. It's very clear to see it for your raw data. And as for the analyzed data, when we're measuring this long dissociation time, for example, if you really see this evaporation to make your raw data looks messy, like a mess out your raw data from your dissociation state, then what I would suggest is you can always cut the time for your data when you're doing this data analysis. So let's say this dissociation time, you're running up to 1 hour dissociation time. Then the last 30 minutes, the dissociation, the data looks messy. Then I would suggest you can just remove the last 30 minutes to correct and to give you a better data for you to analyze. And then you can still have some good data for this. I would say, I'm assuming they are more like a picomolar interaction.
Yeah, I just wanted to add real quick. So the 96 well plate versus the 384 well plate, there's quite a bit less evaporation issues when you're using the 384 well plate. It's not super intuitive to think that way because there's quite a bit less volume, but the evaporation is dependent on the surface area of your buffer that's exposed to the air. So yeah, these longest dissociation times, evaporation is something that you have to think about, but just the stability overall of that entire interaction. If you're only looking at a small decrease in signal, noise can play a factor in the type of data you can pull out. So yeah, the picomolar buffer is something that stabilizes that drift, or any weird anomaly that you're seeing in dissociation. Try the picomolar buffer.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chip. Next question relates to his-tag proteins. And the question is, for his-tag proteins, which of the probe out of streptavidin and nickel NTA is better recommended?
Yes, I am assuming it's which of the probes out of the anti-His probe and the nickel NTA is better recommended. Because yeah, so let's say because the question actually mentioned the streptavidin and the nickel NTA for the His tag protein. If this is the case, of course, I would recommend the nickel NTA because it's much intuitive and much easier to do to measure these to capture your His tagged protein. However, if please correct me if I'm wrong, if you're referring to which of the probes out of the anti-His and nickel NTA is better recommended for His tagged protein interaction, I would say it depends. For example, if you're doing the a little dirty experiment, like your protein is not 100% purified, then I would recommend to use our anti-His probe. The reason is anti-nickel NTA, this kind of service, is always will give you more non-specific and background to those non-specific interaction. However, with this antibody, with this anti-His antibody, you can always have a higher specific to your His tag protein. So let's go back to your question. If this interaction, let's say if your protein is impurified, then I would say both nickel NTA and anti-His probe are recommended. But of course, if you want to measure this interaction is strong, you are measuring a high affinity with your His tag protein, then I would recommend to use nickel NTA because nickel NTA, it can capture your His tag protein more stably. And on the other hand, if your His tag protein is not 100% purified, I would recommend the anti-His probe is a better option for you.
Okay. Another question, which is, I'm taking it out of sequence here, but it relates to nickel NTA. And the question is, what is the best blocking method for nickel NTA?
Blocking method, if you're talking about the when you're doing an assay and you see a lot of non-specific binding happen to this such interaction, if that's the case, then I would say maybe you can try to use some blockers like the His tag, just the histotic only. Try to block the service. However, sometimes if you really want to get a really beautiful one-to-one interaction data, sometimes this blocking state is always not the best option for our user. The reason is you can imagine those blocker will affect your one-to-one interaction at some point. Then when you're doing the binding curve fitting, which may not give you the real beautiful R square up to 0.99, the residual graph is almost zero, or even any tips and tricks to determine the quality of your data. Maybe it will be lower down when you're doing this blocking state. So back to your question, I will recommend you can still try to use this histidine to block your service and see if you can still get a good fitting when you're doing this interaction with our nickel NTA probes.
I think we have time for a couple of questions. So one question is, can you direct us where to find the technical note you were talking about?
Oh, yeah. So we will be sharing this the technical note through our website soon. But at this point, if you want to see this technical note, getting started technical note, please either email to our support@gatorbio.com or info@gatorbio.com. Yeah, and we will help you to give you those technical notes for a better knowledge on BLI.
Yeah, and in this case, we already have the email address, so
Yeah.
we can send it to.
Yeah.
And one last question. Sometimes my data is slightly different from ELISA, and I think this is about quant, it's a generic question.
Mhm.
So how, I guess the question is, how do I reconcile this?
So if the quantitation data is a little different from the data from ELISA, then the first thing I would say is, for example, are you using the very similar strategy to do this quantitation? For example, when we are comparing the HPLC and BLI data from the quantitation, one of the most important thing is that we need to make sure we are using the same technique, the method to capture, to measure this unknown sample. For example, if you're using a protein A column on the HPLC, then I will highly recommend try to compare by using our protein A probes on BLI system. And as for the ELISA, if any different, the concentration is a little different from two different techniques, then I would say if you can see the same trend from both techniques, let's say through sample A through sample D, if their ranking is A, B, C, D from ELISA, and the trend on BLI is also A, B, C, D, then if the data is like a 1.1 X different, then I would say it's more like the factor that you can always apply this factor between these two techniques. Then you can use this like the factor or coefficient between technique to correct your data. And then you can compare these two different techniques and which one can give you the most reliable result.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rich and Chip. I think we are 2 minutes over. So the remaining questions we will certainly answer by email in the next couple of days, or definitely by Monday. I would really like to thank everybody who's attended this webinar. And if you have any questions about the topic, please feel free to reach out to us by email. And we will, as I mentioned, we will be making this webinar available on demand, and we'll be sending a link to all. And last but not the least, happy Thanksgiving to all of you, and stay safe.